So here are some simple guidelines when you're working with watercolors. The watercolors that we have come in these containers. They're called pan watercolors. Okay, you can see that the colors are in a little pan. This set right here, somebody put back without cleaning it first. So your responsibility when you're finished with a watercolor is to make sure that it's clean. In order to clean these up, you can see there's some colors where they shouldn't be. You can get a clean brush, get the brush wet, and gently paint it in the color, picking up color that's not supposed to be there. You can use a paper towel to wipe it off, like this. And you'll do that until you just see the color that is supposed to be in that particular pan, gently lifting up any other dirt that's on there or color that's on there. If there's a little stuck around the edges, that's okay. You can clean it up however you need to, okay? But that's what it should look like when you're finished. I'm going to use a new set just so that we can see the colors very clearly. Okay? All right, when you're using the watercolors, you're going to need a container with some water. These blue bowls work really well for our classroom. You'll need one of these palettes, okay? You can get a variety of brushes. The soft ones work the best. So these work really well. These with the green handle work very well also, and they come in different sizes. You'll need watercolor paper, and the watercolor paper is thicker and it has a texture on it. The watercolor paper doesn't wrinkle when the watercolor goes on it. If you use regular white paper, it will wrinkle. So we want to make sure you use the watercolor paper. So the first thing is a wash. You take a little bit of the water, you put it in one of these little containers, add a little bit of color, and paint it on. Okay, so let's move it over so you can see here. Okay, and that's super light. You can see, you can barely see it. But the more paint that you add to the wash, the more pigment that you add to the wash, the darker it will get. So you can see as I add, it gets darker. So you can practice making a wash that gets darker and darker. Okay? You don't ever want to paint just thick out of here onto the paper. You always want to add water to it because the paint here is meant to be kind of semi-moist. If you put it on the page, it's going to stay that way. It's not going to dry unless you add the water. So the watercolor wash is one technique. Another technique is blending washes. So let's make a little wash in here. And I'm going to make another wash with this blue right here. And you can blend them together. So you can start with your one color and get your next color. And you can let them blend together. So that would be blending a wash. And you can use multiple colors if you'd like. In this case, I just used the two. Okay. Another technique is called the dry brush technique, and you do need a dry brush for it. So you can take your brush, and if it's wet, you'll take a paper towel and make sure it's nice and dry. And you get your watercolor, but just a little bit of the pigment. So it's a little wet right here. This is perfect. Just a tiny bit of the pigment on there. And brush it on like this. It's called dry brush because your brush is pretty dry. And that gives you a texture. Okay. Another thing you can do is called resist. And you can take a wax crayon. White usually works pretty well. You can also use other colors, so I'll put some other colors here just so you can see what they look like. And then you take your wash and you paint it over. So I'm going to make a new wash here with this red. And I'm going to gently, not brushing too hard, paint over the crayon, and you can see that the crayon resists the watercolor. And you see I'm using a very, very watery wash to make that work. Okay, and it'll work with any kind of crayon, any color. Okay, so that would be a resist using that wax crayon. All right, another thing that you can do is called working on a wet surface. So you can put water on your paper, like this, and then you can take color and drop it in. I'm going to get a little bit of this red, maybe a little bit of this blue. And when you work on the wet surface, the trick is just let it be until it dries. Here's an example of working on a wet surface right here. It looks sort of like a tie-dye effect. Okay, another technique you can use is with the permanent marker. So if you draw with a permanent marker on your page, and then you carefully use your watercolor within that space, the permanent marker does resist a little bit, and it will hold your watercolor within that space. So that's another technique you can use. The other nice thing about the permanent marker is that it's permanent. So you can draw and you can paint right over it and it won't blend or bleed through. So that's a nice technique also. All right. And the last technique that everybody always loves is the splatter. If you're going to splatter, you need to take your brush, create a wash of what you want to splatter with. So I'm going to create a wash here. Not too much on the brush at once. And rather than lifting it up and throwing it, you're going to be tapping to create your splatter. So those right there are a few techniques that you can use when you're working with the watercolor.